All right, good morning, everybody. I want to share my screen with you real quick, and then we're going to dive into our last chapter of the semester on therapy. So, treatment, healing actions, healing words for treating various forms of psychological disorders. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. There's some basic features of treatment. There's a lot of different sources of treatment, a lot of different types of people who would benefit from therapy, and there's all different um, types of therapy. So let me just provide a quick overview. What are some of the basic treatments of therapy, and then we'll dive into um, who delivers therapy and the different modes or modalities which therapy is delivered on the next few slides. But first, no matter what sort of therapist that you go to, it's always going to involve a client or a patient, right? The person receiving therapy, the therapist, the person delivering the therapy, and then some sort of theoretical basis for the treatment procedure. So some sort of theory or worldview kind of way of thinking that has been shown to be effective that the therapist is going to direct his or her questions through or direct his or her behaviors, through. Um, we'll talk a lot a bit about a different theoretical basis for various therapies. And some are more effective than others. Some types of therapies are more effective for depression and mood disorders. Others are more effective for like phobias and anxiety disorders. We'll talk about a few. So who delivers treatment? So there's a lot of different folks out there who can deliver treatment. The first person that might come to mind is someone you might have seen on TV, like Dr. Phil. Don't get me started on Dr. Phil. He does have a PhD, but he doesn't have a clinical practice. He's not licensed anymore. The treatment that you'd see on the Dr. Phil show is not therapy. It's not what it's like. In my opinion, it does a real disservice to the field of highlighting people's on national television, bringing people out in a really kind of conflictual environment, forcing people on the spot to make decisions and just bringing out the absolute worst of their family dynamics and then pausing for a commercial break. That is not what therapy is like at all. Dr. Phil is not a therapist. He doesn't have a licensed practice. So who does deliver therapy? Some of the things, some people that might come to mind would be psychiatrists or psychologists. There is a difference between the two. People use these terms interchangeably, but a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. A psychiatrist went to undergrad, majored in psych or bio, whatever, and then took the MCAT and then went to medical school, graduated from medical school, and then did a psychological residency afterwards. So worked at a psychiatric hospital and kind of added on this psych piece at the very end of their medical training. So psychiatrists are really well versed as like medical doctors with a psych training added on to the very end. So psychiatrists, given their medical background, are the only ones who actually would prescribe medication. Psychologists, there's a lot of different types of psychologists out there. Psychologists are working a lot more on what is the behavior, what are the cognitions, what are things kind of leading up to this maladaptive behavior, and how can we change it over time. So in terms of the biopsychosocial model, psychiatrists are going to lean a lot more on the bio, whereas psychologists are going to lean a lot more on the psychosocial component to it. And psychologists and psychiatrists work hand in hand because the most effective therapies tend to focus on the whole person, bio, psycho, and social. So your psychiatrist prescribing medication is also going to refer to a psychologist to work on what are the thoughts, what are the behaviors, what's leading up to this, and how can we make sure progress is progressing the way it's supposed to be. So think of it as psychiatrists prescribing medication, psychologists who graduated undergrad and then got a master's, PhD, or a PsyD. All that training is in psychology. And because it's all in psychology, they don't have the medical basis. So psychologists aren't prescribing medication, psychiatrists do. But psychologists aren't the only ones that do therapy, right? You have both clinical and counseling psychologists. I alluded to this difference last chapter. Your counseling psychologists are like your kind of school counselors, your like a counseling psychologist that you would see at the career counseling center, someone that is going to help people deal with daily life adjustments, normal stressors, normal things that prevent people from living the life that they fully should. Like a career counselor would be a counseling psychologist, helping people find the career that's going to let them live their lives to the fullest. Whereas your clinical psychologists typically work with more um, clinical diagnoses for psychological disorders that are majorly impairing daily functioning. So if you had like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, you would typically go to a clinical psychologist. Whereas if you were experiencing anxiety or depression or dealing with a bad breakup, you would go to a counseling psychologist. So in addition to psychiatrists, medical doctors, psychologists, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, you also have clinical social workers. Social work is a social science field. It works closely with psychology, but social workers are really working within government agencies to really help people on the worst day of their lives when someone gets arrested for domestic violence, when they go into the police station to report sexual assault. There's a social worker that's going to meet with them, and these clinical social workers help in that moment this person share the fullness of their story, help process the fullness of their emotions and experiences in that moment, and then typically defer to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or both afterwards. So clinical social workers do a really great job of providing people with resources in that moment to help them get through that kind of worst day. But clinical social workers typically don't have the same sort of ongoing treatment with patients or clients over time, the same way psychiatrists and psychologists do. You also have marriage and family therapists, MFTs. Marriage and family therapists work with couples, they work with families, they work on these kind of normal issues of newlywed couples kind of navigating different gender roles and different expectations for, who mows the lawn, who takes out the trash, and just like normal kind of stresses that might happen within a marriage or finances. Also, when marriages start to dissolve over time, a marriage and family therapist can really kind of work through that couple's relationships to either get them to work on their relationship and kind of rebound and have a really thriving marriage, or dissolve in the most amicable way so it has the least effect on their friends and family. Marriage and family therapists also work with the family unit as a whole. So they'll do kind of like that kind of group therapy setting where they bring in the whole family and kind of talk about a trauma, if there was a loss of a family member, for instance, or a trauma like in a really bad diagnosis and different members of the family having a hard time coping with this and talking about it. A marriage and family therapist is a nice person that's trained in that family dynamic to really work with different folks. If you want to work with kids specifically, there's licensed professional clinical psychologists that have expertise working with children and adolescents. Your marriage and family therapist is more of the family unit as a whole. There's also, as I just mentioned previously, LPCCs, licensed professional clinical counselors. You have all of these programs at APU, by the way. You have the PSYC, the clinical doctorate in psychology for the folks that want to be clinical psychologists. You have the licensed professional clinical counseling in the psychology department, emphasis on children and adolescents. You have the MFT program, marriage and family therapy program. You also have a social work master's program as well. Psychology is really well represented on APU's campus, and it really does a nice job of testament of like bringing wholeness, of bringing peace and love, and just bringing people back to the fullness with which they were created to do, the fullness by which they were created to live their lives. So anyway, you have licensed professional clinical counselors that can either work with the VA and government agencies. They can either work at hospitals with people experiencing depression, anxiety, dealing with bad news. LPCCs, licensed professional clinical counselors, can also have their own kind of private practice as well, where they see patients. In fact, a lot of our psychology faculty in the psychology department are LPCCs and MFTs and clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists and things like that. Who else delivers treatment? You also have psychiatric nurses that might work in psychiatric units or in psychiatric hospitals, kind of assisting in rolling out the medications prescribed by the psychiatrist, helping to live out some of the behavioral action plans developed by the clinical and counseling psychologists. So psychiatric nurses have that nursing background, and then with that psychiatric training tapped on are a really wonderful resource as well. You also have substance abuse counselors in California. They call them certified alcohol and drug counselors. These are folks that work in a substance abuse clinic, and they help people who are either addicted to any substance, alcohol, drugs, you name it, and they will help them go through the sort of withdrawal, phases, but also develop some of the coping resources that once they are kind of detoxed off of that substance, then they can make sound decisions and put themselves in situations where they're going to be less likely to abuse that substance in the future. We have a lot of health psychologists that focus on substance abuse. We also have a minor in alcohol and drug counseling for people who want to be a certified alcohol and drug counselor. That's a nice career option with a bachelor's degree right after you graduate as well. In fact, a lot of our psych majors, when they take their field experience class, their junior, senior year, a lot of them are working in substance abuse clinics where they're kind of overseeing group therapy sessions. They themselves aren't running the session, but they're helping to make sure that that the group members are interacting in a way that's conducive to this group therapy. And we'll talk about that on the next few slides. Lastly, you also have pastoral counselors. There are a whole range of different pastoral counselors out there. The best pastors that are doing counseling are engaging in faith integration, that they're understanding of what it says, truth in the Bible about God's love and forgiveness and compassion and mercy, and they're bringing all of that to the table. And that's really important, especially for patients and clients coming in with their own kind of faith worldview. That's a fantastic resource for them to draw upon and strengthen to cope with all of life's normal stressors. So pastoral counselors bring that faith piece to the table, and the best ones are also knowledgeable of psychology and the science of what works in understanding the biopsychosocial complexities of people. So in fact, these pastoral counselors, the best ones, have a biopsychosocial spiritual approach to it. In my opinion, some of the pastoral counselors that miss the mark are ones that are just approaching the problem with just one or just the other. So the pastoral counselors understand, like, oh, you're depressed? Well, just pray harder. It's like, well, that's missing the boat here. The richness of people is biopsychosocial, spiritual. So being able to understand the complexity of the psychology of people and then use and rely upon their own kind of faith worldview to help them cope is a really wonderful pairing. But the Christian counselors and Christian psychologists that lean just towards one and really kind of downplay the science are really doing themselves a disservice, because we know that people are wonderfully complex. And faith is a huge piece of that. Let's not downplay the science and the psychology behind what has been shown to make people back to the wholeness by which they're created to be as soon as possible. Luckily, psychology is a science, and there's a whole lot of research on which treatments are more effective than others. Whew. So that was a lot. That was a lot on the slide. The takeaway is there's a lot of different people who can treat psychological disorders, and all of them have different expertise and different resources and skill sets to help meet people wherever they're at. All of that said, there's a lot of different career paths for psychology majors. For some of them that are interested in kind of helping people, there's a lot of different ways to help people. And for the other ones that are curious about why people do the things that they do, there's a lot of different applied careers in psychology as well. And I'd be more than happy to chat about those. If you want to reach out, shoot me an email. I love chatting about that stuff. So that said, all of the psychologists that are engaging in therapy, they can take a variety of theoretical approaches. Let me talk about a few of these different types of therapy, because what might have happened if you've gone to therapy before, or you know someone who's gone to therapy before, they might have had a really great experience, or might have had a kind of a challenging experience. If they've had a challenging experience, it could be that they were interacting with a therapist that was approaching their problem from a theoretical framework that didn't really jive with the research or their own personality and kind of fit. So when you are kind of shopping for a therapist, when you're thinking, hey, I have a problem adjusting or have a psychological disorder and I need help, you don't have to just settle for the first psychologist that you find on Google or the first psychologist that you see at the Career and Counseling Center. Each one is going to approach problems via a different theoretical framework, and a lot of them tie in a lot of the best practices into more of an eclectic framework. So hopefully the next few slides give you a lot more power and knowledge. And when you are talking to people about therapy or talking to therapists about how their therapeutic approach, which theory their theoretical approach lies most heavily on, you'll see what is the best fit for you. And it really depends on the psychological disorder as well. So without further ado, the first theoretical approach I want to talk about is insight-oriented therapies. There's a few different ones. So the insight-oriented therapy is where you want the participant to come up with the answer themselves. It's like, oh, you know what? Talking it through now, I hadn't thought of that before. I didn't realize that, yeah, the person that's been causing me so much problem in my life, my mom, my dad, maybe they were, engaging in this behavior because they thought this. Man, that makes a whole lot of sense. And these insight-oriented therapies, notice that there's a lot of talking. There's a lot of reflection. There's a lot of bringing the pieces together. And it's not the therapist saying, oh, here's the answer to your problem. In an insight-oriented therapy, you want the patient or the client to develop this insight for their own, for themselves. That's going to have a lot more kind of meaning and power for them. But it can also be frustrating for the folks that go into therapy and say, all right, like, what do I do? Your insight-oriented therapies are going to say, well, I wish I could tell you, but it's important that we work through this problem together and really get to the root of it, and you'll come up with that solution via this process. So the first insight-oriented therapy I want to talk about is Freud, right? Is classic psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis was a therapeutic approach that Freud would use that focused on the unconscious, right? It would focus on what is creating stress or trauma within this person that they have kind of repressed down low, that they might have saw something that was really disturbing, like they might have saw domestic violence in the house growing up, and that was so distressing for them as a kid that they didn't know how to process it, so they kind of repressed this memory by pushing it down. And then later on, they're starting to see all sorts of problems pop up with their future relationships when they start dating, or at work when they start interacting with their boss that they don't always see eye to eye on. And it's creating a lot of conflict for them, and they're not sure why. Freud, who engaged in the psychoanalytic therapy, would focus on his psychodynamic perspective. So psychoanalysis, think of that as the therapy, psychodynamic as being his sort of theoretical approach of like, how can we have the psychodynamic, this kind of changing the way that people think about themselves as a way of being therapy in itself. So that was really vague. Let's get specifics. So what Freud would do to that person who witnessed domestic violence, they may not know that the early experiences that they saw in the first few years of their life of domestic violence in their own home is with them. And it's shaping their ability to interact with their friends and their family and their coworkers and the people that they're dating and their future husband or wife. So what they would do in a psychodynamic setting is bring the participant in and engage in free association. They would say, hey, sit on this couch, look at the wall in the old kind of classic ways. Sit on this couch, look at this wall, and just tell me the first few things that come to your mind. Why are you here? There's no right or wrong answer. And they want this person to just free associate, let whatever comes into their consciousness out in that moment. And the psychoanalytic therapist will sit behind the person so they can't see their face, so they can't read like, ooh, that was a good answer, that was a bad answer. In a free association, there's nothing good or bad, it's just the first thing that comes to mind. And then the rationale is all those deep impulses, all those repressed memories and all that trauma that's deep down below conscious awareness. In free association, it'll start dripping up. It'll just come to mind. And that's what the therapist will really talk about. Hey, it seems like you're talking a lot about your parents. What was your childhood experience like? And bringing some of these painful memories into conscious awareness, which people can then start processing those. So within a psychodynamic therapy session, you would see free association. You would also see dream analysis, where the therapist would ask, hey, I want you to keep a dream journal. And next week when you come in, tell me about all the dreams that you saw. And from a psychoanalytic perspective, dreams are the kind of royal road to the unconscious. When this person is sleeping, they aren't consciously saying, no, I don't want to think about this, I don't want to talk about this. All those personal motives and drives and all that stuff, that's down there on the unconscious, that's causing so much conflict and stress, starts boiling up, starts manifesting itself as symbols in people's dreams. And your psychodynamic therapist is going to be trained in what are some common symbols. So if this person is dreaming about babies and the baby is being dropped, for instance, the idea of a baby is someone who is vulnerable, that is young, that's still dependent on other people, and now they feel like a sense of loss of control, like they're being dropped. So what a psychodynamic therapist would say, well, who is this baby? Is it your baby? Was it you? And start getting at some of the roots of, hey, I'm starting to see some themes here where we're seeing dreams that show a loss of control or some sort of fear about being dependent on other people from a really young age, and then start making some of those connections. So then the participant will get that insight of, oh, yeah, that's right. I hadn't thought about that. Those early experiences are affecting my life today. So that's that sort of interpretation piece that the psychologist is going to do. And along the way, start developing these various defense mechanisms. Freud said there were a ton of different defense mechanisms. I'm not going to talk about a bunch of them today, but some of the kind of classic ones that you might have heard of before. One defense mechanism is repression, kind of pushing it down below conscious awareness if something is too stressful. It's not a great defense mechanism because the problem is still there. You're just not thinking about it. Another defense mechanism that Freud proposed was projection. So when someone is really angry, for instance, instead of acknowledging, hey, why am I angry? What's the root of my problem? They'll start looking at other people and saying, you know what? You keep yelling at me because you're so angry all the time. Well, is the other person angry or is it you? Are you projecting your own anger onto other people? If someone was having conflict about not being happy in their marriage anymore and wanted to be in a relationship with someone else, they might project their own sexual fantasies onto their partner and saying, you know what, you're just trying to cheat on me all the time. And it's like, well, no, the partner may not be trying to cheat on you, but you were thinking about infidelity. So now you're projecting that infidelity onto your partner instead. It's a defense mechanism that isn't a great way of actually dealing with problems. Anyway, Freud proposed a lot of defense mechanisms. The research doesn't support very many of them, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you don't like this theory. During therapy, the psychodynamic therapists would sometimes interact with people and they would be resistant to therapy. They would say, you know what, like nothing's coming to mind. Yeah, you're asking me to free associate and say the first thing comes to my mind, but I can't think of anything. Freud would argue as, you know what, that's resistance to therapy. There must be some sort of block that this person doesn't want to get through. During therapy, some clients might start projecting some of their feelings onto their therapist, where they might be really trusting and say, yeah, you know, therapist, whatever you want to do, I just trust you completely. Well, it seems like somewhat of a transference of the patient or client starts treating their therapist like their father, or starts treating the therapist like their boss. It's like, no, you're getting angry at me, or like you're trusting on me too much. Like, I'm the therapist. You're transferring some other feelings you have towards someone else onto the therapist themselves. So these are all very kind of psychoanalytic concepts that your psychodynamic therapists are going to focus on. The problem with psychoanalysis, that free association, dream interpretation, things like that, telling about your whole life story, starting when you were a kid, your first memory, those therapy sessions would last years. You would come in every week for months and months, years and years and years. And it would take years for people to get that sort of insight. People don't have years. So instead, what you see is although Freud was wrong about some of the defense mechanisms and the Oedipus complex and the id, ego, superego, he was wrong about all that stuff. But he was right that people have unconscious attitudes and unconscious motives that they aren't even aware of. And they start kind of creeping up, and you know, from their unconscious, people do have the unconscious attitudes. These motives start creeping up and they start impacting their life today. And one of the biggest things that creates those early impulses and drives are early childhood experiences. So what you have today is psychodynamic therapists who are now doing therapy in weeks rather than years. Psychodynamic therapists are going to jump into, okay, what is the problem today? Let's not start with your first childhood memory. What is the problem today? Why do you think that's going on? So it's a lot more kind of quick, streamlined, jumping into the insight, but not going overboard with id, ego, superego, things like that. I think I've mentioned this numerous times. Freud wasn't a data guy. Freud wasn't a scientist. Freud didn't do research on the efficacy of his therapies. He didn't test whether people's personalities were developed as id, ego, superego. He didn't do research to see people develop through various psychosexual stages of this Oedipus complex. That wasn't Freud. And later on, what they're showing is, although Freud was right about some things, he was wrong about a lot of others. Other psychologists like Carl Rogers and humanistic psychologists were all about the data. They're saying, you know what, I think this works, but that's just my hypothesis. Let me test it. I think this is going to be effective. I think this is going to make people less depressed or less anxious or more creative and confident, like into the fullest versions of themselves. But I don't know. Let's test it in a controlled setting where one group gets this new therapy, the other group doesn't get therapy, or the other group gets another form of therapy. These humanistic psychologists did the research and they found that, yeah, humanistic therapy is effective. And like psychoanalytic, it's focused on this insight, kind of coming up to the person of, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. So these humanistic therapists, flash back to a couple of chapters ago when we talked about personality psychology, and we talked about some of these kind of humanistic models that people are inherently good. And the reason why their personality isn't developing to the fullest version of themselves is because they have conditions of worth on them. Their friends, their family, their boss, all the people around them are saying, you are only good if you do this, if you get a certain GPA, if you publish so many papers, if you pass so many classes, if you get into this school, then you're a person of worth, then you're going to be successful. But if not, then you're out of luck. Those are conditions of worth that prevent people from growing into the fullest version of themselves. So what humanistic therapists like Carl Rogers over here would do is they developed a whole client-centered therapy. So instead of like telling about your unconscious, nope, they were centered on the client. Let me focus on you. Let me show you all the the ways that which true relationships should really be. And their theory was, if I can show them, get them to realize that there's this incongruence between who they are right now, their real self, and their ideal self, on who they want to be. If I show them that, hey, this is what you're capable of, but you're not there yet, people are going to naturally want to move towards that, to become the fullest version of themselves, right? Their ideal self. But the problem is those conditions of worth, the world around them, the kind of thoughts that they're having about themselves are kind of blocking themselves from becoming the most ideal version of themselves. So in these insight-oriented approach, you would have these humanistic psychologists show empathy. So, you know what? I can understand why you would feel that way. Yeah, when I'm in similar situations, I feel the same way too. How validating is that? Say, you know what? Sometimes I feel like cheating on my partner. You know what? Yeah, a lot of people cheat. You know, like understand like that motive, that temptation is there. There's like pornography everywhere online. There's like normal dips in happiness throughout a relationship. Like I've been there. Like I can empathize. I know why you would feel that way. You know, I just get so angry at my parents sometimes. I just want to like wring their necks. It's like, you know what? I get that. I understand. Like I can put myself in your shoes. I've been really angry too. That is incredibly validating for people, not to show them that they're wrong or they're evil or they're bad, but just showing that, you know what, I've been there too. And the whole time while they're showing empathy, they're also showing unconditional positive regard. And they're saying things like, you know what, I'm not going to love you any less because of that. I know this thought came into your head that you thought about cheating, but I'm not going to think any less of you for having that thought. Right? I'm going to love you through it. Like I'm not going to put a condition of worth on you. I'm going to have unconditional positive regard. I'm going to care for you and value you as a human being because like you were like created in God's image, and you are a human being that's like every human is naturally imbued with value and worth. So no matter what you say, no matter what you do, you are still a human being. I'm going to value you because of that. And the whole time while they're showing empathy and unconditional positive regard, as this person is kind of talking about what's bothering them, they're tracking by congruence. They're making sure, hey, are we on the same page here? It sounds like you're angry. Is that right? Are we on the same page? It sounds like you were not angry, but like frustrated that this goal didn't go the way that you wanted. Is that right? Was it frustration, not anger? So that way they can empathize, and that way they can show this unconditional positive regard the entire time. So while you're talking to these humanistic therapists, the conversations are awesome. They aren't telling you the answers of what you should be doing, but they're supporting you in a way as you're processing this for yourself, that when they start realizing, like start thinking through everything that's going on, it's like, you know what, yeah, I am doing that because I'm putting this limit on myself. You know what, I am capable. Thank you for making me feel that way. Maybe the reason why I'm not pursuing my goals is because I'm surrounding myself with like haters. I'm surrounding myself with people that think that I can't do it. And what the goal of this humanistic therapy is, between their real self and their ideal self, if they start going to therapy and start saying, hey, I like empathy. I like unconditional positive regard. I like when people track in a congruent way onto what I'm thinking and feeling. When you start putting them in these conditions of this like truly loving and like supportive environment, then people start to minimize that gap. They start to becoming the most ideal version of themselves. And the goal from a humanistic therapist is that the same bond that you're creating with therapy in that moment would last all week long, all month long, year after year. People would start creating the same relationship they have with their therapist with every other person in their life. So all day long, every interaction, they start striving into the best version of themselves. It sounds really soft. It sounds too fluffy, but humanistic therapy does work. It significantly reduces anxiety, significantly reduces depression, and deals with a lot of the challenges that people experience with normal life transitions. Here's a picture of Carl Rogers leading a group therapy. Humanistic, this kind of client-centered approach is really common within group therapy sessions, because instead of just Carl Rogers creating congruence, unconditional positive regard, empathy with one other person, why not amplify that and magnify that and model it in front of other people? So then when people are kind of going around and saying, yeah, I felt this way, or sometimes I just really hate my partner, I hate my parents, or I hate my siblings. People next to them are saying, you know what, yeah, I've been there, I felt that way too. I've done the same thing. I'm not gonna think any less of you, think any less of you because of that. So then they start realizing, hey, this person's treating me this way, I can treat them the same way. It's not um, it's not dismissive saying, hey, it's fine to cheat on your partner, it's fine to be angry at people. It's saying, hey, like that's, that was a way that you felt, and that way that you felt was real. But the reason why you're here is because the way that you're feeling right now, your real self, isn't where you want to be. You aren't living the life that you feel like you were called to. So how can we get you to where you want to be? And that's where this humanistic therapy is really effective. So it's one thing me talking about it. It is totally different if you watch it. So I would highly recommend that you watch at least the second video. It's a 5-minute video of Carl Rogers engaging in client-centered therapy. There was a patient named Gloria who, for research purposes, came into therapy and agreed to let her therapy session be video recorded, so other future therapists could kind of watch it and kind of see what does a humanistic therapy kind of look like. So I'd highly encourage you to watch this video up until the 5-minute mark of Carl Rogers engaging in this client-centered therapy. Later on, that same Gloria woman went to other therapists who are practicing a different approach, and I've linked those clips as well. So it does a nice job of Gloria talking to different types of therapists, and just notice how different those therapeutic sessions are. This first video is Carl Rogers highlighting the same kind of talking points of unconditional positive regard, empathy, congruence. But when you're watching this, I want you to notice that Carl Rogers isn't giving the answers to Gloria. You know what? I really wish I could tell you the answer, because I know like how bad you want to know the answer. But just notice how his voice is changing. So soft, so warm, kind of leaning forward, asking open-ended questions, and making sure that he's tracking the whole way. So just really kind of validating and like creating this sort of relationship between client and patient that is so conducive to growth of this person becoming the fullest version of themselves. So anyway, pause the video, watch that clip, definitely worth it. Especially when it comes to like applying this knowledge. Don't just read the textbook, don't just listen to this lecture, hit the pause button and watch the therapy for yourself. That's where you start seeing these concepts come alive to you. So far we've talked about Freud, kind of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapies, right? Slow versus fast. We've talked about humanistic psychologists, folks like Carl Rogers. Now I want to shift gears and talk about behavior therapy here. Behavior therapy stems from kind of learning theory, that operant conditioning that we talked about before of why are people behaving this way? Well, the reason why people are behaving this way, even if it's a maladaptive way of treating people poorly or treating themselves poorly, is because they've learned it over time. So behavior therapy, a type of therapy based on learning principles that focuses on changing observable, measurable behaviors. They don't focus on feelings, they don't focus on thoughts. Behavioral therapy is, what are you doing today that you don't want to be doing? What are you doing today that you want to extinguish? Right? Are you saying hurtful things? Well, saying a hurtful thing is a behavior, and psychologists can absolutely change behaviors. They can increase them or they can decrease them by changing the environment, by how this person has learned to behave in that setting. They can also ask questions of, what are you not doing that you want to be? Well, I'm not opening up about my feelings. I'm not talking to people. It's like, all right, let's not focus on feelings. Let's focus on like the behavior. Do you, want to have these conversations with your long lost cousin? Do you want to start flying on an airplane to visit your family? If that's a behavior that you're not doing yet, how can we change that behavior? So what behavioral therapists will often look at are the ABCs. What are the antecedents, kind of before, kind of leading up to this behavior? What is the behavior itself? And what are the consequences? So you'll have um, uh, a lot of psych majors, strangely enough, after graduating, become ABA therapists, applied behavioral analysts. And what they'll do is this behavioral therapy approach. They'll work with people, for instance, that have kind of lower functioning autism, and they might be like slamming their head against the wall over and over and over again until it's bloody. The parent is really frustrated. Like, I run up, I stop this person over and over and over again, but they keep doing it. What's going on? Help me. What the behavioral therapist is going to do is watch the video, kind of look back and say, what led up to this? What were some of the kind of warning signs? What situations is this most likely to occur, so we can start predicting that behavior in the future? So what's leading up to this? And what we could do is, cut some of the things that are leading up to it. That would stop the behavior. Well, let's say that this is, normal life, right? Person isn't getting enough attention, so they start engaging in the behavior of going up to the wall and banging their head against it over and over and over again, so much that they start breaking the skin, start bleeding. And what's the consequence? Not consequence as in like the bad thing, right? What is the thing that comes after the behavior that keeps it being reinforced or punished, right? What is the reinforcer? What's the punisher? And they might see on this video, well, the parent always runs up and stops the kid, puts a hand in front of its head, gives them a hug and says, please, please, please don't do this. Mom loves you, dad loves you so much. Please don't do this to yourself. And what a behavioral therapist would say, oh, the reason why this behavior keeps occurring over and over and over again is because in these settings, the kid engages in this behavior and the consequence is being rewarded. Mom and dad are giving attention to this behavior. So as harsh as it sounds, what a behavioral therapist might suggest in this moment is, let's give the kid a helmet. And in these situations where the kid starts engaging this behavior, slamming their head against the wall over and over again, mom and dad, ignore that behavior. They're wearing a helmet, they're going to be safe, but I want you to stop reinforcing this behavior. Instead, what we want to do is put them in other situations where they can start doing a counter behavior that you want them to be doing all along. You wanted them to go talk to their friends, or you wanted them to come over and let you know when they needed your attention or something, or you want them to go read a book. Notice as soon as they start engaging in this other behavior that you wanted to occur, start reinforcing it. Start adding a positive consequence for that behavior that you want them to be doing all along. So then when they're doing something else, right, they can't be doing both at the same time. Let's use our learning principles to decrease, punish, right, by no longer reinforcing this self-injurious behavior, and start rewarding this pro-social behavior of looking at other people, talking to mom and dad, reading books. And then what you'll find is their behavior will start changing. Kids with oppositional defiant disorder, right? Kids who just are not listening to mom and dad. Mom and dad say, hey, you need to listen to me, don't do that. And the kid says, F you, jumps up on the counter and starts peeing on the dishes in the sink. Major problem, oppositional defiant disorder. What they would go to is a psychologist who's thinking from a behavioral therapy perspective, when is this occurring? What is the kid specifically doing, and how can we change it? And what you find is there's a few different types of behavioral therapies out there, but they're incredibly effective for dealing with phobias and other types of anxiety disorders. So stemming from that like little Albert study where people were classically conditioned to have fears, what you can do is apply the same sort of learning principles to get people to unlearn their fears in a single day or over a few sessions. Behavioral therapy is incredibly effective at treating certain psychological disorders. So let's say that someone had a uh, anxiety disorder like OCD, right? And the obsessive thought was there are germs everywhere, and their behavior was obsessive hand washing. Right? What you could do is first exposure. So not letting them withdraw, not letting them hide from whatever is stressing them out and causing them anxiety. Instead, you want to do the opposite. You want to expose them in a controlled situation, expose them and prevent the normal response that they engage in. So in this case, if someone has a phobia of germs, right, what you want them to do is expose themselves to a dirty trash can. And normally when they would withdraw and wash their hands real quick, say, you know what, we aren't going to do that. We aren't going to wash our hands real quick. We're going to live with that stress and anxiety of putting your hand in a dirty trash can, of what that would do to you. And the rationale here is that anxiety surges, right? When you expose yourself to germs and you are terrified of germs, your heart rate is going to go through the roof, right? But it doesn't stay there forever. What happens with arousal, whether we're stressed out or anxious or any sort of like panic attack or anything like that, is we experience this kind of this quick increase, this like flush of arousal. But then over time, it starts decreasing. Right? Our heart rate starts coming down a little bit, and we realize, you know what? I thought I was going to die. I thought this was going to be the worst thing ever, but it's not. And over time, what you find is this quick surge decreases over time, where if you keep engaging in this exposure and preventing the response over time, they'll start having less and less of that sort of stress arousal response. So exposure with response prevention. If this sounds like a lot for people, like I mentioned last week, my grandma has a major fear of snakes. What I might do is this exposure with response prevention and just have it imagine. Say, all right, grandma, I want you to close your eyes. You know you're in a safe place, right? You know you're in the office or you're at your kitchen table or wherever you feel safe. Like, you know there's no other animals or anything else going around. Close your eyes. Now imagine a snake. Right? Imagine you holding a snake. Right? And of course, right, grandma's going to freak out because she has a phobia, right? But it's irrational. There's no snake here. It's just imagined. And grandma's heart rate is going to go through the roof, but it's going to eventually start coming down. In fact, what a lot of behavioral therapists will do is put like heart rate monitors on the patient, on the client, and show them their own feedback. Say, hey, do you see how quickly you freaked out here? But you didn't last forever, right? It came back down. It came back down in 5 minutes. So then they would do the same thing again, right? Imagine a bigger snake. Right? Imagine you holding a snake. Imagine a snake wrapping around your arms, right? Things that are going to cause them a lot of anxiety. And they'll show them their same sort of biofeedback. Say, hey, notice that your peak didn't go as high as it did before, or it only took you 4.5 minutes to come back down to baseline rather than 5 minutes before. We're making progress. So what you can do is for a variety of different anxiety disorders like OCD, phobias, PTSD, you can do imagined, in vivo. So in vivo, kind of real world, actually give them a snake, actually give them a mouse, something like that, bring them onto an airplane, something like that, in vivo in the real world. Or what you can do is use virtual reality, which is kind of like a hybrid between the two. It's not real, but it certainly feels real. If someone is experiencing PTSD, for instance, you can have them engage in like a virtual reality game where they're going back through the same sort of war-torn country that they were in before, when they developed a lot of that initial stress response. And then they're going to peak, and then they're going to get all that biofeedback and say, hey, but we're going to remain calm. I'm here with you. And over time, watch that anxiety decrease. So this exposure with response prevention is key. It's effective. There's a few different ways of going about it. All or none, or slow by slow. This all or none is referred to as flooding. Flooding is incredibly effective, and it lasts a single session. So this way, if someone has a fear of heights, today's therapy session, we are going to meet at the Hancock Tower in Chicago, and we're going to meet at the bottom, and we're going to take the elevator up to the top floor of the tallest building in America, and we're going to stand out on the ledge, and we're going to look out. You're going to be safe. There's glass there, but we're going to go in one setting all the way to the top. You have fear of heights. We're flying on an airplane together, right? It's like 0 to 100. You went all there. You have a fear of snakes, Grandma. Here's a python that I brought to therapy today. And what you find is this huge peak, but then afterwards it comes back down and people realize like, well, I can do this. I can handle the absolute worst, and I didn't die. I experienced arousal, I got really freaked out, but now I'm noticing that I can control that with deep breathing, with other relaxation techniques I'm learning via therapy, and it doesn't last as long. I can handle this. That way I can handle less stressful situations in the future. But flooding isn't for everybody. In fact, for some of you, like kind of got freaked out when I just talked about flooding maybe. For my grandma, I think she's like 80 something, like I'm not gonna recommend flooding. She might have a heart attack and die. Instead, what I would suggest is systematic desensitization. So systematic, so step by step, we're gonna slowly desensitize grandma, or whoever it is, to whatever is causing arousal in the future. So let's say grandma has a fear of snakes. What I'm gonna do in therapy is saying, all right, today we're gonna do an exposure therapy called systematic desensitization. I'm gonna expose you to a fake snake, right? And I know that's gonna freak you out because you have this phobia, but know that it's fake and your anxiety won't last forever. That arousal, that heart rate is gonna come back down to baseline over time, okay? So then what you would do in a systematic desensitization, from across the room, pull out a rubber snake and say, hey, see, this is completely fake. It's rubber, it has a made in China, sticker on the bottom, like this is absolutely a fake snake. And because this phobia is so irrational, the person with this phobia is gonna freak out, right? They're gonna peak, then they're gonna come back down. And by the end of therapy, now they're relaxed and that fake snake is sitting on the table. You say, great, you've exposed yourself to this fake snake and now you're no longer stressed out. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you next week, right? And the next therapy session, notice how we're gonna systematically, step by step, keep desensitizing grandma to more increasingly real stimuli. So next week, there's a real snake in there and it's in a cage, it's on the other side of the room. So grandma comes into therapy and it's revealed that, hey, there's a live snake, but it's 20 feet away from you, right? It's in a locked cage. It's a non-venomous snake. It has a lock on it, but you can see it, and it is real, but you're not going anywhere near it. In fact, it's not coming out of there. It's very secure. Grandma's gonna freak out, right? But that anxiety isn't gonna last forever. It's gonna come back down close to baseline after a while. And by the end of that therapy session, grandma's gonna be like, okay, you know what? I was in a room with another live snake and I didn't die, right? I was able to control my own arousal and anxiety and thoughts with these relaxation techniques and breathing techniques. And then that's it. Say, all right, I'll see you, for our next therapy session, grandma. And the next therapy session, now notice that the snake is still 20 feet away, but now we cracked the lid. It's no longer locked. And we're telling grandma, it's like, I know you're freaking out right now, but it's a non-venomous snake. It's still 20 feet away. It moves very, very slowly. It's not gonna hurt you. And sharing all this extra facts and details about the snake, ways that are slowly going to calm down grandma, where she realizes, hey, I was in a room with a snake that was out of its box and I was okay with that. I was relaxed after an hour setting. She wasn't initially, but by the end of it, you can't maintain a hyper sense of arousal for too long, right? It peaks and then it comes back down. Then for the next session, so we're slowly increasing the snakes, we bring in, her grandsons, her granddaughter back there. I say, okay, what we're gonna do is bring in your grandkids and they're gonna stand 20 feet away and they're gonna hold the snake. Non-venomous, safe snakes. There's gonna be a trainer in there, like sharing all this, research. And now grandma is freaking out, then calming down. Saying, you know what, I'm not holding the snake. It's 20 feet away. It's people that I care about, but I had my arousal, and now it's kind of decreasing over time. But then my next therapy session, we have grandma holding the snake herself, freaking out, right, draping around her shoulders, and saying, you know what, like, it's okay. You know, I freaked out, but I didn't have the same sort of peak as I did before, right? I know this is coming. I know with my relaxation techniques and breathing techniques how to bring this down. I didn't shoot up as high as I thought I was going to. It didn't last as long as I thought it was going to. Notice how this is the eventual behavior that we wanted to get to. Grandma holding a snake. In systematic desensitization, we went step by step by step by step. Fake snake, locked snake, open snake, children holding snake, you holding snake. Slowly over time, slowly kind of building up to where we wanted to go all along. Flooding is where you jump right to the stage. Both techniques are shown to be effective. Flooding is just a lot faster, but it's not for everybody. Let's see here. What else do I want to talk about? Behavioral therapy. There's techniques based on operant conditioning, kind of reinforcement and punishment. I talked briefly about ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysts, that would work with what is reinforcing this behavior. But let's say someone is experiencing agoraphobia, which is a fancy way of saying this person has a fear of being in public spaces. So this fear of being in public spaces causes a person to live in their home their entire life, and they never leave. They go to school online, they work from home, they get their groceries delivered from home, they never leave their home because of this agoraphobia. This like lack of control. What if I'm in a public situation and I can't get out, or like, what do I do? So what a behavioral therapist would do is say, hey, obviously you can't come to the office for therapy. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna meet you, right? In the first therapy session, what they might do is chat and see, what do you really want? What are you missing? Like, what's something that you still love doing but you can't anymore because of agoraphobia? And the person might say, you know what, like, I really love my best friend. We used to hang out all the time, but now like our friendship is getting strained because she's tired of coming over all of the time. She invites me out other places, and like, I just get too anxious. I experience panic attacks, and anxiety gets the better of me. I'm not leaving my home. So I miss my friend. So what they might do is say, hey, for our next therapy session, I'm gonna bring your friend, and we're gonna sit on your porch, but you have to step outside your front door to have this conversation with your friend. So now notice that when the person is engaging in the behavior of taking one step outside the front door, we're gonna reward it with something that's pleasurable, right? With a conversation with a long lost friend that this person really cared about. So these behavioral therapists are thinking, what can I do? Rewards and punishments to change people's behavior over time. Behavior therapy is just about behavior. What are you doing that you want to stop, or what are you not doing that you want to start? Behavioral therapists don't care at all about what's going on between your ears, right? They think from a staunch kind of behavioristic view, is the only thing that matters is what you can observe, behavior. Cognitive therapists come along and say, no, right? The reason why you might be experiencing depression, for instance, is the way that you're thinking. So a cognitive therapist would focus on changing your thoughts. So cognitive therapy, designed to help clients think realistically and rationally in order to reinterpret events that would otherwise lead to distressing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So notice here that's about correcting. That this person might start having this negative thought that pops up automatically and say, nope, when you think that, it's causing you to, to be sad, to engage in more eating, to sleep less. Like it's bothering you. Let's stop the way that those negative thoughts are coming up. There's a few different cognitive therapists that I want to share. The first type of therapy is called REBT, Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, was created by Albert Ellis, this guy down here, who was from the Bronx. He was from New York, and was very in your face. He had this very high kind of nasally accent like this. And when he would do as a cognitive psychologist, to challenge people's illogical and self-defeating thoughts. So think of REBT, this rational emotive behavior therapy, as kind of getting in your face and kind of talking to this really persuasive person that says, hey, the way you're thinking about the world and thinking about yourself is wrong. It's irrational. And they would start challenging those thoughts kind of in your face to show that you're wrong. So let's say you're clinically depressed and you say, you know what, like, no one in the world likes me, and like, it's just really important to me that everyone like, likes who I am. Albert Ellis would be, really? There's 8 billion people in this world. You literally expect to interact with 8 billion people and every single one of them needs to like you? That's impossible. That's not going to happen. There's way too many different people, way too many different value systems. There's no way that everyone in this entire world is going to like you. And that's fine. So like in your face saying you are wrong in the way that you're thinking, right? Challenging that irrationality. That basketball player that's saying, you know what, like, if I'm not the GOAT, if I haven't won this many championships, if I don't win this many games, if I don't get this many MVP trophies, then I'm not worthwhile. Really? According to rational emotive behavioral therapy, in your face, you have to win to be a person of worth. Did you know that every single time a game is played, half the team loses? That's impossible. You cannot win all the time. It's irrational to think that way. So now notice that Albert Ellis is in your face challenging these unrealistic, irrational thoughts that people have. Very different than Carl Rogers. So what I encourage you to do is watch this video again of Gloria talking to Albert Ellis, a rational emotive behavioral therapist that is engaging this type of cognitive therapy, challenging those irrational thoughts. And I want you to notice that someone like Carl Rogers doing a lot of listening, not sharing a whole lot, but creating this idea of like, hey, tell me about what's going on. I wish I could tell the answer, but insight, you need to develop it for yourself through this conversation, through this relationship. Very soft, very different. That's humanistic. REBT with Albert Ellis now knows that he's a lot more confrontational. He's talking a whole lot more to show that she's wrong. So anyway, really, really cool type of therapy. Cognitive therapy is effective. But there's some folks that don't like this sort of in your face, New Yorker, brash, kind of let me challenge those irrational thoughts. Instead, what you might like is more of a Beck's cognitive therapy. And Beck was all about, what are you telling yourself? What are these cognitive distortions, these automatic thoughts that come up that are just wrong, that are distorted, that you're viewing yourself and viewing the world and viewing other people in a way that isn't right? And what he found through a lot of these conversations is people that were clinically depressed tend to engage in a lot of dichotomous thinking. Either I'm okay or I'm a failure. Really? There's a whole spectrum there. Right? So whereas Albert Ellis in rational emotive behavioral therapy would be in your face saying, that's wrong. How can you believe that? Beck would be saying things like, you notice here that you're saying there's only two options. Are there only two options? Actually, you have a lot of different options here. So pointing out that they're thinking about the world in distorted ways that are contributing to their depression. They're engaging in catastrophic exaggeration. Right? They're going to the absolute worst place. Well, if I created a dating website or like on Tinder or whatever, and I swiped a bunch on people and like no one got back to me, no one likes me. And if no one likes me, that means I'm never gonna date anyone. If I don't date anyone, I'm never gonna get married. If I never get married, then I'm gonna spend the rest of my life at home, be miserable, and buy a bunch of cats to make me happy, but I'll still be miserable because I just have cats and nobody in my life. Then I'll die alone, and then no one will check on me, and my cats will eat my body, and I'll die. It's like, what? All because no one swiped right on you on Tinder? All of a sudden you're gonna die alone and have cats eating your corpse? Like, whoa, that's a huge catastrophic exaggeration. So Beck would start pointing out, hey, you're thinking about the world and yourself and people in ways that are contributing to your depression. he would also point out some mental filters that people might be having. So when people are sharing positive feedback about themselves that kind of challenges the negative view about themselves, people might block that out. Well, yeah, not everyone swiped, last time they weren't interested. One person did, but that person looked like a loser or whatever. That person like wasn't attractive or I don't know. It's like, well, you see that? Like you're ignoring this feedback from other people, saying that like you were desirable as a potential partner, so it's not all bad. Or, man, I'm gonna be a failure in life. But did you pass that psych class? Well, yeah, that's just one class. And didn't you tell me like Dr. Carlson said that you were awesome and he saw a lot of potential in you and like you really enjoy going to office hours and like having those conversations? Well, yeah, but that's just Dr. Carlson. He's nice to everybody. It's like, no. You're putting this mental filter that's blocking out the positive so you can just focus on the negative. Beck's cognitive therapy is going to challenge those sort of cognitive distortions and question people's automatic negative thoughts that they're telling themselves. And he would assign homework saying, you know what, let's test these hypotheses. You had this negative thought. You said that you can only be happy if you're in a relationship. Is that true? Right. You said that you have to be in a relationship, you have to be dating or married to be happy. Well, have you always been in a relationship? Well, no, like I wasn't in a relationship when I was in elementary school. Yeah, but like, were you happy as a kid? Were you happy in elementary school? Well, yeah, I was happy back then for a while. It's like, see, you were happy when you weren't in a relationship. So your statement right now that you have to be in a relationship to be happy is false. It's a testable hypothesis. And we show you that you're wrong. You have been happy in the past. This pattern of thinking doesn't make sense. So a lot more like subtle. It's not rational emotive behavioral therapy in your face. It's asking these questions in a way that people realize, hey, the way I'm thinking about myself and the world and people around me, those are wrong. I need to change that. And one of the ways that they do that is by giving people homework during the week. They'll say, all right, in a situation, think of that automatic thought that comes to you automatically without even thinking about it. And how does it make you feel? So when I'm studying, I'm thinking to myself, you know what, like I won't do as well as I want. I want an A+, I'm just not going to get that. So that makes me start feeling kind of nervous. And people might start feeling like a lot of anxiety. So, all right, keep the journal. Where are you feeling anxious when I'm studying? What's the thought that led to this? Well, I'm not going to do as well as I want. And then what can we instead say to ourselves instead? What's a different way of thinking? Well, even if I don't get an A, I'm not going to fail. And that kind of reduces anxiety. So then now you have this journal, this sort of homework assignment that people are bringing with them all week long. And then the next session, the therapists like ACK will, or ACK with Beck, will start using the responses to that and start saying, hey, I've noticed that your anxiety's gone down a lot. Or it seems to be like a lot of problems like studying for exams and expectations in college. Let's talk about that. Why is it really important to get A+? What is a realistic expectation for you? Things like that. All ways are going to make people less anxious. And ironically, less anxious you are, the better that you would do in the first place. So those are cognitive perspectives. I mentioned earlier that a lot of psychologists take more of an eclectic approach, meaning they might use like a behavioral therapy, but then borrow from like the humanistic, approach, and that's fine too. Right? Take the best of both worlds. You see this really common with cognitive and behavioral. Cognitive, all about what's up here. Behavior, what are you doing? So a hyper effective therapy is called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and they take both. They say, all right, like when you are experiencing anxiety, going to the grocery store, what's going through your head? Cognition. Let's incorporate cognitive therapies. Let's also incorporate behavioral therapies. Let's start rewarding this sort of behavior. Let's start getting you out there. Let's start like not letting you avoid and distance yourself from this. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is very effective as well. And some psychologists specialize in both, cognitive and behavioral therapy. Last is more this kind of biological based treatments. Because people are biopsychosocial, there is a antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiolytics, like are effective at treating psychological disorders, but they aren't as effective as doing them in partnership with bio and the psychosocial. So that's why you have psychiatrists and psychologists working together. There's a movement, a stigma about, well, what if I go to therapy? So I'm just going to take drugs instead, and might lead to a culture of like overprescribing. There's a happy medium here. There are certain psychological disorders that absolutely benefit from the biological because they have such a strong genetic component to them, or such a strong neurotransmitter component to them. And then it's dumb to not take a biological based treatment if it's going to work for you in consultation with your psychiatrist. The same way there are some psychological disorders that are so cognitive, they're so behavioral, that are so social relational that it makes complete sense to work with a psychologist. So a lot of times it's a combination. So don't be overly dismissive of the bio piece. One of the psychological disorders that has a strong genetic neurotransmitter approach to it is schizophrenia. Right? We know that it's largely genetic, and antipsychotics are effective. So antipsychotics like Risperdal that are kind of modulating how much dopamine is being released in certain parts of the brain, which are leading to hallucinations, where the person is seeing things or hearing things. Antipsychotics alleviate some of those positive symptoms. Positive symptoms meaning like in addition to normal functioning. And antipsychotics are effective. Like any medication, they are still generating research. And what you found is the first generation antipsychotics, 1940s, 50s, 60s, you would see a lot of these negative side effects from people who would use antipsychotics for extended periods of time. And one of those negative side effects was tardive dyskinesia. So this woman over here is experiencing some of these symptoms characteristic of tardive dyskinesia, of kind of like involuntary muscle spasms of the body and the face. And there's some people that said, well, I don't want those side effects from those early antipsychotics, so I'm going to get off my meds. And they would not use antipsychotics, and their hallucinations and things would start coming back. Luckily, there's been a lot more research, a lot more development, and now we have second generation antipsychotics that alleviate, that don't have as many of the same negative side effects. For things like depression, right? There's a lot of different drugs out there. You see them on TV commercials, right? The little bouncing balls that look really sad, all of a sudden they get happy. Those bouncing balls are serotonin, right? That's from a neurotransmitter. And what you find is drugs like Prozac and Zoloft and Paxil are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So when you have one neuron kind of sharing neurotransmitters with the next neuron waiting to kind of absorb those, if they're passing along serotonin, right, this feel-good neurotransmitter, sometimes is either there's that serotonin just isn't making the connection from one neuron to the next. So your brain isn't firing as often to say, I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy. Now it's saying, I'm happy. I'm happy. It's taken too long. So drugs like SSRIs, what they'll do is when the first neuron, right, in this kind of terminal button, will release the serotonin to get into the next neuron, instead of being like reabsorbed by the first neuron, what these drugs will do is kind of block it. They'll put this kind of wall up. So when the serotonin comes through, it won't get kind of allowed to get reabsorbed by the first one. So it makes it hang out in this gap for longer. So there's more serotonin hanging out for longer periods of time. So that's what effective, hanging out there longer, more likely to get absorbed, and the next neuron starts firing. I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy. You're also finding SSRIs also being effective for various anxiety disorders as well. There are other biological-based treatments like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Electroconvulsive therapy has had a really bad rap in the media. If you've watched the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, what electroconvulsive therapy will do is generate an electric charge on the temples that goes through the kind of frontal lobe that does a kind of like reset of how those neurons typically function. And it is effective in alleviating some of the mood disorders like bipolar and depression, things like that. Because when neurons fire, it's both electrical and chemical. Right? Neurotransmitters, they get picked up, starts this kind of chain reaction of changing kind of sodium potassium going through the neuron. Basically, it is both a chemical and electrical. So like you have to have the certain neurotransmitters present. Then the neuron fires through this electrical process as well that kind of pushes the axon through that causes it to fire to the next one. Basically said, because it's both a neural and an electrical process, generating an electric current through someone's frontal lobe at really, really low levels helps do this kind of reset. And it is effective. They're still figuring out exactly why and what types of levels and disorders and patients are most likely to benefit from it, but it is effective. It doesn't look like this. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, does not look like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where someone is involuntarily held down, generating electric current through their frontal lobe that's causing their entire body to spasm out of control. It's not painful. Instead, what electroconvulsive therapy looks like today is in a medical setting, properly restrained, under anesthesia, like, generating this electric current through the frontal lobe, but it's not against their will. In fact, people seek out ECT the same way they seek out psychiatrists and psychologists. So ECT is effective, and it's not as stigmatized as it used to be. There's other biological-based treatments like anxiety disorders, benzodiazepines, things like Xanax and Valium are great at reducing the sort of peak of arousal that people would experience. So it just leads them to like a kind of decreased, kind of relaxed mood. And these can last from 1 to 36 hours. And depending on the individual and their dosage and level of anxiety, Xanax and Valium can be effective at dealing with various anxiety disorders. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoy learning more about therapies. Last chapter on psychological disorders and therapies go hand in hand. There's a lot more courses just related to these topics. In fact, if you want to be a counseling psychologist or a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist or a clinical social worker or a licensed professional clinical counselor, anything like that, chat with me and I can help connect you to other clinical and counseling related faculty that I can talk to you about what these careers look like. On a personal note, it's so refreshing to know that life doesn't always go the way that we're supposed to. Sometimes we don't live up to the fullest version of who we know that we were called to be. Sometimes we experience too much anxiety, too much depression. Sometimes we're seeing things and hearing things that are like preventing us from being the person that we always wanted to be and felt called to be. And that's one of the reasons why I love psychology so much, is all these clinical and counseling psychologists can step in and rely on the research, rely on the science, and share their compassion in a wonderful way to make people capable of living the fullness of their lives. Remember that 26% of people will will be diagnosed with a psychological disorder any given year. And it's so wonderful to see that there's so many people and so many resources out there to get them back on track to live the fullness of which God called them to be. Anyway, that's all I have for you for therapy for this chapter. This is the last lecture of the semester. I've loved chatting with you guys. I love sharing psychology with you guys. I wish the rest of the semester would have ended like face-to-face. We would have had this conversation in person, but just because it's online, it's distance learning, it's a little different. Don't let that negate the tremendous power and progress that you've made this semester. You guys have learned so much about general psychology. I'm really proud of you guys. You guys are working so hard. You guys are sharing so many positive, insightful, and thoughtful comments in your discussions that it's been really rewarding to me in this really stressful and challenging time. So I'm very grateful for you guys as a class. And I know this is, just a 100 level course. If you're new to psychology and want to learn a whole lot more, the sky's the limit. Come chat with me. I'd love to get you kind of hooked up on what a psych major could look like, or double major, or what a psych minor could look like. It's only 18 units and so many psych classes double dip with GE. So if you're interested in a psych minor, let me know. Or if this was just like a GE class for you, and this is just an exposure to what makes people wonderfully unique, I hope the lessons that you learned in this one class carry through in your future career and your future relationships and the rest of your life. And realize that you guys aren't alone. There's so much power and research going on into what makes people so wonderfully unique. So that's it. I'm done pouring my heart out. It's been a great semester. I love you guys, and know that if you need anything after the semester, I'm here for you. Even though I'm not in person sharing this message, pretend like I am, and I will see you back in the fall. All right, take care, guys.